Joseph Loseyu was tremendously important for British cinema. He arrived like a sort of meteor in the British scene. He had fled America, come from America, because of political pressures. And so he was one of those people who crossed the Atlantic to escape from the climate of McCarthyism in America and had to find what work he could in Britain. But right from the start, he was somebody who had a reputation because it was known that he'd taken part in some quite important avant-garde work. He'd been involved with Brecht. He was an intellectual, and that was unusual in British cinema at that time. So he came with the advantage of coming from American cinema, which gave him a certain advantage in Britain, but at the same time he was clearly something special. And right from when he started to make films, genre films, just whatever films he could get to make, The Gypsy and the Gentleman, The Criminal, he was clearly doing something different with these genres. He was taking quite traditional genres like the gypsy film, the bodice ripper, or the police thriller in The Criminal, and he was doing something special with them. But when he began to make a reputation, then there was a kind of need to change gear and to move up a notch. And I think what you see in the 60s is really something quite remarkable. It's a project to create a British art cinema. The British have always felt very bad about art cinema. They always felt it was something that foreigners did better. And this question of whether you really could make a film in Britain that would be the equivalent of, the Nouvelle Vague in France or the great new Italian cinema was always a question mark in people's minds. Was it possible? Was it even a good thing? The partnership that Joseph Loseyu formed, particularly with Harold Pinter as the writer, and the three great films they made together, really is the best single argument for an English art cinema. Harold Pinter was a rising playwright. He had been an actor, and he had begun to really distinguish himself writing this very new kind of play, which is full of menace and not at all pretentious, set in very realistic settings, but somehow the use of ordinary language, very carefully spaced and delivered with great precision, became a whole new dramatic tool. And Pinter was a very new and important voice in British theatre, but he was also somebody who wanted to write more broadly than theatre would allow, and he had to make a living. And so writing scripts was something which he fell into, and he became one of the great scriptwriters. Still is, in some ways, one of the greatest scriptwriters, I think, that has come out of English writing. And it's a very important part of his career. He's done things in cinema which he has never done on stage. And it's something he feels quite proud of, I know, having talked to him about it. He's even written screenplays which have not been filmed and have been published as pieces of literature. So the partnership he formed with Joseph Loseyu moves from The Servant through Accident to The Go-Between. And these three films use pre-existing works, novels, but they completely take them apart and put them, reassemble them in a completely filmic way. And so they're really works that in many ways are more intense, more carefully worked than the original novels. They almost improve on their source material. I don't think people would be so interested in Maugham's novel, The Servant, if it weren't for the film, The Servant, which really is a major creation in its own right. And the same is true for Accident, Nicholas Mosley's novel. Again, the film is at least as important as the novel, maybe more important. And the same is true for the Go-Between, which is a considerable novel, but in Loseyu and Pinter's hands it becomes really an extraordinary work of art. And I think as time has passed, we've come to realise that this really was a high point, a sort of plateau in British filmmaking. Perhaps it's important just to set the scene a little bit in the 1960s, at the beginning of the 60s, because everything is changing in British cinema at this time. Everything is changing in world cinema. The new cinemas of Italy and of France were creating a revolution in the world of cinema. It was a very exciting time. People were going to festivals and seeing films by Antonioni, by Godard, by Truffaut, and they were getting very, very excited by these. And it was also a time when filmmakers were moving around much more than they had done in the past. So, for instance, filmmakers were coming from Eastern Europe, having made their first and second film in Eastern Europe, would come to Western Europe. And so, for instance, someone like Polanski would come to Britain. And that again began to shake up British cinema, which had perhaps been rather kind of traditional. Dick Lester, who came from North America, came to Britain, and if Dick Lester hadn't come in with his experience in television and his very eclectic approach to filmmaking, well, the Beatles would not have appeared the same on screen. So you have a situation where a film like Help, the Beatles' first film, is a kind of avant-garde film, because it's made by a foreign director who has brought a whole new approach to it. It's a different world from the way that the Cliff Richard films were handled back in the late 50s and 60s, early 60s. So when Loseyu starts to make these new films, beginning with The Servant, I think there's a lot of admiration. There's a feeling that really this is British cinema beginning to grow up and make a more serious kind of film. I'm sure there were people who thought, this is too arty. But the mixture was very interesting. The mixture of elements in the film was extremely interesting because you had Dirk Bogarde, who of course had been a great matinee idol. He was somebody who had been groomed by the Rank organisation to be, a dashing, handsome male star. And he was tired of playing those parts. He desperately wanted to do something more serious. And so he was very much looking for new roles, new directions he could go in as an actor. And that led him, first of all, to Loseyu, and then, of course, it would lead him to Visconti and to a whole range of other filmmakers. So again, we can see The Servant as a really crucial moment when this very, very famous actor really moves in a whole new direction. And people were mesmerised by it. They were fascinated. This is a very daring part for someone who's only been a matinee idol. Imagine, for instance, if Rock Hunter had played a part like that. That's the kind of shock effect that this new departure in Dirk Bogarde's career produced. And Sarah Miles was also a very new figure. She was very much a figure of the 60s, somebody who was identified with a kind of, a sexuality that was not common, a sort of overt sexuality. And so the combination of Bogarde and Sarah Miles and this new, very handsome actor, James Fox, was explosive. This was a very, very sexy film.